The devil sells his wares in many forms, but that night in Jericho Springs, he came as an orphan girl with eyes the color of a dead winter sky. Silas Blackwood wasn't a man given to superstition. He was a rancher with 30 starving cattle, a soul worn smooth by loneliness, and a single silver dollar that bought him the girl the saloon owner swore was unclaimed property. When he led her to the cold line shack, she didn't fight. He didn't understand that the choice was never about possessing her body. It was about whether his own soul could survive the echo of hers, breaking a debt that came due at dawn when he woke up screaming her name and couldn't stop. The high plains wind was a sculptor of bone. It had carved the canyons, stripped the trees, and for 3 long years it had worked on Silas Blackwood's soul. The land itself was giving up. His 30 cattle were walking skeletons, their hides stretched tight over jutting ribs, their lowing a dry, rattling complaint against a brassy, unforgiving sky. The creek bed, once a ribbon of life, was now just a scar of cracked mud and bleached stones. Every landmark was a tombstone. The largest, a pair of simple wooden crosses on the hill, marked where his world had ended. Sarah, Little John. He never spoke their names. He didn't have to. The silence in his cabin screamed them loud enough. He worked from can't see to can't see, a moving statue of stoicism. He mended fences that held nothing in. He cleared brush from land that would grow nothing new. His hands, calloused and hard as petrified wood, moved with the grim economy of a man who had declared a personal war on stillness. It was the only way to keep the quiet from taking root inside him. But every evening, as he stepped into the one-room cabin, the silence would win. It clung to the cold iron of the stove, to the untouched quilt on the second bunk, to the small, fading letters S+S he had carved into the wall beside his own cot. This evening, he found his thumb tracing the shape of his wife's initial, a ghost touching a ghost. That was the moment he decided. He couldn't face the silence another night. Jericho Springs was less a town and more a collection of sins held together by mud and desperation. Silas rode in not seeking pleasure. The capacity for it had been burned out of him, but simply noise. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the sour notes of a saloon piano, the drunken shouts of men who still had something to shout about. He tethered his horse and pushed through the batwing doors of the cackling hen saloon, the last silver dollar in his pocket feeling heavy as a tombstone. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and regret. Silas took a seat at the far end of the bar, letting the chaos wash over him. It didn't help. The noise was just a different kind of empty. It was then that the saloon owner, a greasy, ferret-faced man named Barlow, slid up beside him. "Tough season, Blackwood," he grunted, wiping the bar with a rag that only rearranged the filth. Silas just nodded, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. "A silence like yours. It can eat a man alive," Barlow continued, his voice dropping to an insidious whisper. "I got something for that. Fresh off the stagecoach. Orphan girl, quiet. No one's claimed her." He jerked his chin toward the back of the room, and Silas saw her. She was sitting on a crate, small and still as a fawn hiding from a wolf. Her dress was a plain burlap-colored thing, and her black hair hung in a tangled curtain around her face. She wasn't looking at anything, but her stillness was a scream in the raucous room. It was her eyes that caught him. When she finally looked up, he saw they were the color of a dead winter sky, holding a kind of emptiness that made his own loneliness feel like a shallow puddle. In that moment, a desperate, irrational thought took root in Silas's mind. Perhaps one void could be filled by another. He slapped his last silver dollar on the bar. The sound was sharp, final. "She's not for sale," Silas said, his voice rusty. "I'm paying her debt. She's free." Barlow laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Call it what you want, rancher. She's unclaimed property. You pay the dollar, you claim her." The walk back to the ranch was a long one, the girl trailing behind the horse like a phantom. He hadn't asked her name. She hadn't offered it. When they reached the cabin, he lit the lamp, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. He gestured to the second bunk, the one that had stood empty for years. "You can sleep there." She didn't move. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the howling of the wind outside. She looked at the rope bed. Then her gaze shifted to the crude carving on the wall. Esplazes. Then she looked directly at him. Her dead winter eyes held his, and in their depths he saw a profound and terrifying understanding. She took a step closer, stopping just before him. Her voice, when it came, was a dry whisper, the sound of autumn leaves skittering across a grave. "I am your property now." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. In her voice, Silas heard not submission, but the final brittle snap of a soul giving up. And in that moment, the dam of his own grief, held back for years by relentless work and stoic silence, finally broke. He reached for her, a simple, brutal act to fill the emptiness of his life, a desperate attempt to prove that something in his world was still alive. He took what he thought was his, sealing a bargain he could not comprehend, and pulling the trigger on a fate that had been lying in wait for him all along. Silas awoke to a deeper cold than the pre-dawn air could explain. The brutal release of the night before had not brought warmth or relief, only a hollow echo. Elara was already up, a small, still silhouette against the gray light of the window. She moved through his small cabin with the weightless grace of a phantom, her presence a silent, constant question mark. He had expected something: tears, anger, fear. He received nothing. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting only the ugliness of his own desperate act. Days bled into a week of this suffocating quiet. Silas threw himself at his work with a renewed fury, a man trying to outrun a ghost on his own land. He displayed his competence like a shield. He repaired the rotting corral fence with meticulous precision, his hammer blows echoing a rhythm of fierce control. He hauled buckets of water from the deep well, his muscles straining, a tangible payment against the intangible debt he felt. He even managed to find a small patch of graze far to the north, moving the last of his dying cattle with the grim determination of a general refusing to concede a lost war. But none of it mattered. He would return to the cabin, exhausted and caked in dust, to find a bowl of thin stew left on the table. She wouldn't eat with him. In fact, he never saw her eat at all. She would simply sit on her bunk, mending a tear in her drab dress with tiny, perfect stitches, her dead winter eyes seeing something far beyond the cabin walls. The silence began to fray his sanity. The nights were the worst. He was tormented by nightmares, fragmented visions of fire and blood, and the chilling sound of whispers, in a language he did not know but understood in his bones. It was a language of pure grief. He would wake in a cold sweat, the whispers seeming to linger in the corners of the room. He started to talk to her, his voice rough and loud in the oppressive stillness, a desperate attempt to prove this was still his home. "What's your name?" he demanded one evening. She simply met his gaze and continued her stitching. "Where are you from?" Nothing. The questions became pleas. "What do you want from me?" Each time she would simply look at him, her silence an absolute and unbreakable wall. He had thought he was buying a companion to fill the emptiness. Instead, he had bought an abyss, and its depths were beginning to stare back at him. It was on the 8th day that the world finally tilted. He was searching for a stray calf down by the dry creek bed when he heard it, a sound so alien in his world of silence that it stopped his heart. A low, haunting melody, ancient and sorrowful. He followed the sound and found Elara kneeling by the water's edge. She had built a small, intricate spiral of smooth gray stones. In the center, a raven's feather stood upright, trembling in the wind. She was humming the melody, her eyes closed, a priestess at a forgotten altar. "What is this?" Silas's voice was a harsh crack in the air. "What are you doing?" Her humming stopped. She opened her eyes. For the first time, they were not empty. They held the weight of a century. "The land is thirsty," she said, her voice clear and cold. "It remembers the price that was paid. It demands the debt be honored." A chill that had nothing to do with the wind crawled up Silas's spine. "Debt? What debt?" She rose slowly to her feet, her gaze leaving him and fixing on a single gnarled cottonwood tree that stood alone on the opposite bank, its branches like skeletal fingers against the sky. "Ask the man who planted this tree," she said, her voice a low prophecy, "what he paid for this land." He didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to ride away and never look back, but he was trapped by a question he now had to answer. He crossed the creek bed, the dry earth crunching under his boots. The base of the old cottonwood was thick with gnarled roots, like claws gripping the earth. Unnerved but driven by a force he didn't understand, he began to dig with his bare hands, tearing at the dry, compacted soil. A few inches down, his fingers brushed against something soft, leather. He pulled it free. It was an old, rotted pouch, the kind his father used to carry. With trembling hands, he untied the drawstring. It wasn't gold. Inside was a handful of tarnished silver coins, each one identical to the single cursed dollar he had slapped on the saloon bar. And beneath them, something else. A single, child-sized moccasin, beautifully beaded but stiff with a dark, ancient stain. The world went silent. The wind, the insects, the distant cry of a hawk, all of it vanished. There was only the weight of the pouch in his hand and the terrible, dawning understanding in his heart. This wasn't just her past, this was his, and his own desperate transaction was not a beginning, but the final damning echo of an original sin. The blight took the rest of his cattle within a week. They died not of thirst or hunger, but of a strange, wasting sickness that left their eyes wide with a terror Silas was beginning to recognize. He became a prisoner in his own home. A fever took hold of him, and the nightmares were no longer confined to the night. He would see them now in the shimmering heat haze of the day-flickering shapes of people moving at the edge of his vision, their faces gaunt with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical blow. Elara was no longer his property. She was his warden. She brought him water when the fever burned hottest and left bread by his cot, her face an unreadable mask of cold duty. He was terrified of her. The sight of her still form, her silent judgment, was a torment worse than any physical threat. Yet, he was utterly dependent on her. One afternoon, in a moment of crazed clarity, he decided to flee. He stumbled to the corral, his legs weak beneath him. His horse, his last connection to the outside world, lay on its side, a hind leg bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. The bone jutted out from the hide, a stark white punctuation mark on his failed escape. He returned to the cabin, defeated. He gathered the last of his strength and roared at her, "Get out! Leave this place!" He stood in the doorway to throw her out, to reclaim his home. She simply stood before him, an immovable object, her dead winter eyes holding his. He was the one who fell back, a king dethroned in his own crumbling castle, completely stripped of power and autonomy. He was now the property, and the house was his cell. In his delirium, stumbling through the small cabin, his hand fell upon the heavy, dust-caked lid of his father's old sea chest, the one he was always, under any circumstances, forbidden to open. The glimmer of a final, terrible answer shone from its dark, iron lock. With the last of his strength, Silas lunged at his father's sea chest, the one thing in the cabin that held more secrets than the girl. The lock was old and rusted. He smashed it with the butt of his pistol, the sharp crack of iron, a satisfying violation of his father's command. The lid groaned open, releasing the scent of dust, dried leather, and a faint cloying sweetness like pressed flowers. Inside, nestled amongst survey maps and deeds, was a thick leather-bound journal. His father's journal. His hands shook as he opened it. Abner Blackwood's handwriting was a harsh, unforgiving scrawl, the words marching across the page like soldiers. He wrote of drought, of cattle, of building a legacy from the unforgiving dust. Silas's fever-bright eyes scanned the pages, hunting for a truth he already felt in his bones. And then he found it. An entry dated 30 years prior. Abner wrote of a tribe, the whispers of a forgotten name, who refused to cede the land by the creek. He wrote of them as obstacles, as pests. "A hard necessity," the entry read. "For this family to live, they cannot." Silas read on, his breath catching in his throat, as his father detailed the swift, brutal massacre under the light of a full moon, the payment of 30 silver pieces to his hired men, the silencing of a people. His gut twisted. The pouch he'd found at the roots of the cottonwood was the proof, the blood money that had bought this land. He almost closed the book then, unable to bear more, but his gaze fell upon the final horrifying entry on the page. Took something back. A spoil. The seer's infant girl. Something about her is unsettling. Her eyes, the color of a dead winter sky. Left her with the nuns in Jericho Springs. A life for a life. The land is paid for. The journal slipped from Silas's numb fingers. The air in the cabin became thick, unbreathable. It wasn't a curse from the outside. It was a poison that had been in his veins since birth. His land, his home, his name. All of it was built on a foundation of slaughter and a stolen child. His own desperate act in the saloon, the single silver dollar, was not a new sin. It was a generational echo, the ghost of his father's crime playing out through him, the blind self. He had lived with his entire life. The belief that he was a good man suffering a random misfortune was shattered. He now saw the terrible, intricate architecture of his own doom. The final payment for this unbreakable bargain was not just his sanity. It was his soul. He rose from the floor, the fever gone, replaced by a clarity as cold and vast as a winter prairie. He walked into the main room. Elara stood by the hearth, her back to him, staring into the dying embers. He held the open journal in his hand like a verdict. "Is this it?" His voice was a raw croak. "Is this the debt?" He expected her to turn, to show fury, to perhaps even raise a weapon he had not seen. He expected a reckoning of blood. Instead, she remained perfectly still. Her calmness was more terrifying than any rage. "The sin must be witnessed," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of ages. "The debt is not paid in blood. Blood is too quick. It is paid in soul." She turned then, and her eyes, those dead winter eyes, held no hatred. They held something far worse, a profound, eternal sorrow. "My mother saw this the night she died. She saw a house built on our bones, and she prophesied that it must never again stand empty. Its silence must be filled with the echo of the crime." The true price of the bargain settled upon him, a shroud of absolute and perfect horror. This wasn't about his death. His death would be a mercy. This was about his life. He was to become the living monument to his family's crime, the ghost that would haunt his own land forever. His legacy. Not the ranch, not a son, but this, an eternity of screaming grief to fill the silence his father had created. This was the justice the land demanded. This was his 5-second moment of change, the final terrible understanding. "I thought a soul was something you could buy to fill an empty house, but now I know a soul is a debt that once broken can never be repaid." Slowly, deliberately, he walked past her. He did not touch her. He walked into his small, cold bedroom and closed the door. He was home. Elara stood by the fire until the last ember died. She walked out of the cabin into the pre-dawn chill, closing the door softly behind her. The sky to the east was a pale, bruised purple. She sat on the top step of the porch, a silent sentinel wrapped in the cool air, her duty finally done. As the first blood-red rays of the sun broke over the desolate horizon, a sound began to rise from within the cabin. It was a man's voice, raw and ragged with disbelief, calling a name, and then it broke into a scream of pure, undiluted agony, a scream that echoed across the plains, filling the vast, terrible silence, a scream that would not stop,